Hi guys, this is Weasel for PokerVIP.com. Today we're going to be discussing a few situations where we can pick up pots without Showdown. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about red line game versus blue line game. The majority of beginning players have a much stronger blue line than red line. This is not always true, but it's true in the majority of cases. The reason for this is that their viewpoint on poker is that poker is about making hands. The idea is you make a hand, then you extract value with that hand. And this kind of approach to the game can produce reasonable results up to maybe even NL25, maybe even NL50. It does depend to an extent on how well you read the hands of your opponents. But let's say you have excellent hand reading skills and you're mainly focused on making hands, you're still going to do pretty well. You're not going to have a super high win rate, but you're going to do well. And this kind of approach may even give you a high win rate at the lower limits, 2NL, 5NL, 10NL. However, we're going to find that our progress reaches a plateau where we can't really progress any further. Because by taking this approach towards the game, we're only really understanding half of the game. Only half of poker is about making hands. In fact, you could easily argue that actually making hands is probably the least important aspect of poker. In fact, perhaps the most important aspect of poker is how we can win pots without having a hand. And unless we understand key concepts related to how we can increase our red line, we're not going to be able to successfully progress beyond NL25 or NL50. This is exactly why many players get stuck specifically around these limits, is because they don't understand this whole other area of their game, which is to do with the red line or non-showdown winnings. So the first step is to acknowledge that there is fold equity. So this may sound strange, but a common argument that lower limit players have is that everyone's so bad, no one's folding. But this is actually not true, and you can even check this for yourself. And I'll show you how you can run one check for this a little bit later in the video. But the first thing to appreciate is there is fold equity. And if you don't believe me, next time you have top set, for example, you have any strong made hand, do you always get 3 streets for value, or do your opponents call twice and then fold the river? And any time that you don't get your value hand paid off for as many streets as you would like, it means your opponent is folding, therefore you have some fold equity. And rather than your opponent exploiting you by folding when you have a value hand, you also need to find a way to exploit this and understand that your opponent is making folds in certain situations, and you can't always have a value hand in that spot. You need to understand how to exploit his tendency to fold with a hand that's not a value hand, basically. It's also important for us to understand that theoretically also bluffing is mandatory in some situations. Players don't really think of bluffing as ever being mandatory. They think of bluffing as a choice. Whereas if we think about something like value betting, we have top set on the river, we have the nuts, our opponent checks to us. Hopefully a lot of you realize that it's absolutely mandatory that we bet. It would be horrible not to value bet the nuts on the river. Whereas people don't think about bluffs like this. They don't think, okay, I'm on the river with 6 high, I lose to pretty much everything, yet my opponent's folding a reasonable range, perhaps his range is capped, it's mandatory that I bluff. Players don't think about bluffs like this. They think of bluffing as something that they can choose to do or they can choose not to do. So they don't feel bad about checking down something like 6 high in the river when it's clearly a profitable bluff. But the same way we have mandatory value bets, like we have to value bet the nuts on the river and a whole bunch of other really strong hands, it's also mandatory that we bluff in some situations. If we want to develop as good players, it's important that we appreciate that bluffing is not actually an option. Bluffing is something that you have to do in many situations, otherwise you're playing a very bad game of poker. So the idea is we want to begin to learn situations where we can commonly exploit our fold equity. So some situations we won't have much fold equity. Other situations you'll see that arise very commonly where we can get our opponents to fold very frequently. So all we simply need to do is we need to learn these situations, and then we can begin exploiting them because we'll recognize them when they appear in a game situation. So we're going to discuss 3 of these situations. So the first one is what I refer to as orphaned pots. may or may not be a term you're familiar with. It is a poker term, but I don't know if it's used that commonly. So we'll explain exactly what orphan pots are, and then explain how you can exploit this to win pots without showdown. The second situation is when the pre-flop raiser checks out of position and doesn't c-bet. And we'll find that he often has a capped range. This is something we can exploit. We can very often get him to fold his hand by the river. And the third situation is to expand our 3-bet range in position. I put button here, but it's not just on the button. It's basically anywhere in position is a really great way to improve your winnings without showdown, to improve your red line overall. So let's start with the first one, which is orphan pots. What exactly is an orphan pot? An orphan pot is a pot without an owner, so please adopt him. So what do we mean by this? So no one shows interest in the pot, so everyone's just checking down. Clearly no one really has a hand, no one really wants the pot. It's basically free money in the middle of the table. And a big mistake players make is they join in with the crowd and they just check down with everyone. And they say, well, I'm not interested in this pot either, I check. Whereas a good player is going to say, no one's interested in this pot, I'm going to take this pot. And you can often win lots of small pots like this with very small bets because no one's really interested. So it's a big mistake actually to not take advantage of these pots. Again, it's a spot where it's mandatory for us to bluff. So in particular, look out for 2 or more simultaneous checks. So if your opponent checks and then you check in position on the flop, and then on the turn your opponent checks again, there's a very high probability that he's not interested in the pot, because if he was interested in the pot, he would probably lead the turn after you check back the flop. I mean, not always. There's always going to be a small percentage of the time your opponent's slow playing or he's picked up something on the turn. But in reality, overall, in the long run, you're going to be getting a ton of folds if you're betting in these situations. Same applies for river situations. It could get checked down to the river multi-way. It just goes check, 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 check. And then on the river, one player checks and then it's the action's on you. You have to lead in this situation. So please do not check down 7 high, even in multi-way situations. It's just bad poke. If no one is interested in the pot, you need to take that pot away from them. So let's look at some examples of this. So we have 8-9 offsuit on the button and we decide to open raise and big blind calls, and I really don't like this flop. Obviously want to c-bet quite aggressively in general, but I don't really want to c-bet this flop, so I check back. And my intention is to fold the turn if opponent leads, so at this point in the hand I'm essentially giving up. But just because I'm giving up at this point in the hand, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm giving up on the turn or river if new information comes to light. So here opponent checks, and he checks again. A very decent chance he doesn't have anything. However, when I say he doesn't have anything, he could easily have a stronger hand, like he could have king jack offsuit, queen jack offsuit, and even 10 high is going to beat us in this particular spot. We can fold out these hands very, very easily. It's not that likely our opponent has an ace. He might think about leading the turn in this case. Obviously it's not impossible. He may check twice with an ace, but generally speaking our opponent's range is very weak here. Even if we do occasionally get called down by pocket tens that double checked or something, there's a very good chance that we're going to make this very profitable in the long run by betting here. So opponent checks twice, he doesn't seem interested, we have no equity whatsoever. Well, I mean, we may have some equity obviously, but very little equity. However, it doesn't matter because our opponent's not interested in the pot. This pot doesn't have an owner. We're going to take this pot down. So ace-2 of hearts. We 3-bet in position. This is a very strong play. Very nice hand to bluff against an MP open, especially in position, suited ace, which we'll talk a little bit about soon. Okay, again, a very bad flop. I really don't want to c-bet this flop. I am intending to c-bet quite frequent in this spot, but 6-5-7 of diamonds is really not my flop. So I just check back. Intention is to give up. Opponent checks again. Now hold on, if he's got anything decent here, he's probably going to lead. If he's got ace queen, he'll lead. If he's got some kind of diamond semi bluff, he'll probably lead. There's a good chance he just holds something like ace jack or king jack suited, or maybe ace king. He's called a 3-bet out of position. Very good chance we can take this pot down. So again, no equity, but he doesn't seem interested in the pot. He's checked twice. I'm going to bet. So please don't check here in this situation. Queen 6 offsuit. I complete in the small blind. This is something I do very frequently, and I think it's a very good play. I think you can potentially even complete any 2 cards in this particular spot, especially when you're playing against 2 fish. Not so much against regulars, but then again, if you're playing against a regular, he wouldn't be open limping in the first place. So You can complete very wide, much wider than you'd imagine. You're getting insane pot odds, and we have okay equity, and we have okay implied odds because we're playing against very bad players. So if we flop something big, we can exploit them. So not a good flop for us. King 9-9. Again, my intention is just to give up here. Okay, they both check, so they're possibly not that interested in the pot. So we could even think about leading the turn right here. But I like to be a little bit more cautious in these particular situations, so I think I decide to check again here. Again, still planning on check folding. Okay, but now it's getting checked down, and the river is pretty much a blank. It does complete a flush draw, but neither of these guys have a spade draw. It's pretty clear. I would consider that very unlucky if one of them had a spade draw. Very unlucky if one of them has a king or a 9, or basically anything. They may have some very weak hands, like pocket 6s, pocket 7s, like ace 5 suited maybe. But yeah, definitely nothing stronger than a pair of 8s at the absolute maximum. They're not going to have a flush, for sure. The chances are that they just have random holdings that completely miss the board. Some of those random holdings will be ace high holdings. There'll be things like pocket 2s. So it's actually good for us just to bet here. So a lot of guys will just check down here because they'll say, okay, wasn't interested in the pot. I'm just going to be like the other two guys and just check down. I only have queen high. But they're not interested. They both checked 2 streets. This is definitely an orphan pot. No one wants this pot, so let's take this pot. It's free money, basically. I mean, when I say it's free, I mean you will get called some percentage of the time, but you won't get called that frequently. So in a sense, it is basically free money in the middle there. So it's a shame if you're not picking up these small pots. Jack 5, I decided to overcall here. It's a little bit marginal, but we are getting a very good price. Again, pretty bad flop texture for us. Check, check. Again, nothing really improves on the turn. So although it is definitely fine to have a turn leading range here, and I think it's very good to have a turn leading range because neither of these guys look interested so far, I'm going to do it with hands that have at least a gut shot or something. Jack 5 of clubs, this is absolutely nothing, so I go for a check again. However, that doesn't mean I'm giving up on the hand if new information comes to the light. Neither of these guys have a diamond draw. Neither of them have a 10 or a 9. They don't have any set. So unless they've rivered something like pocket 3s, they just don't have anything. So a very good spot to lead. We're going to take this pot down so frequently, so please don't check in this situation. Queen 10, standard button open. Probably should be a c-bet here. We have 2 overs in the backdoor straight, so not sure why I checked. I think this is a pretty clear c-bet in this spot. Maybe I had some reads on the guy, I'm not sure. Again, he checks twice, and here we have considerable equity, so there's absolutely no reason not to bet the turn here. Ace Queen, standard under the gun open. Get called by the big blind. Not a good board texture for us. It's perfectly fine not to c-bet. Opponent checks, but we pick up some equity. He might lead if he has a king. He'd obviously lead if he had any set or any flush draw that he wanted to bluff with, maybe even some of his gut shots. So his absolute strongest hand here might be something like ace 10 suited, or maybe like jacks or queens, but overall his range is very capped. More than likely he has nothing. We just bet, we take the pot down. Even if we do occasionally get called, we have maybe even 2 overcard out, our ace or queen. We also have a gut shot. If he does call us, maybe even calls us with worse some of the time as well, like some kind of draw. So overall betting is going to have a very good expectation here. So yeah, look out for this double check is basically the theme that we're seeing here. Open raise 10s. I don't think we need to c-bet 10s on the king queen 2. I think it's weak enough that we can give up on the hand. However, our opponent checks again. So notice here that I'm going to bet here, but this is not really a bluff. So we do bet here as a bluff. If we had if we had 8-9 of clubs, which has no equity, we'd probably bet here and hope to take the pot down. But here we have pocket 10, so it's not really correct to say it's a bluff. But it's very important you bet for protection here as well. So something like pocket 10s, it's very important you don't just say, okay, I've got showdown value, I check. That's basically no good because you're just letting your opponent free roll a ton of equity. He might have something that he's folding all day. Like he may have something like ace 5 of clubs, for example, and he's just folding that all day. So you're never going to get value. You're never going to get value from him anyway. If the turn goes check check, he's just going to check the river usually, and when you bet, he's going to fold anyway. The only difference between taking the pot down now and taking the pot down on the river is if you check back 10s here and he has ace 5, then you're letting him see a 10% chance to suck out on the river. So it's very important that we also bet here for protection with some weaker made hands as well. So very important to bet. So we bet quite small here. Notice there's no need to bet really big in this situation. We're literally just protecting a hand. Anytime we're betting for protection, we can definitely use a very small sizing. And especially given that our opponent's folding so much anyway, it doesn't make sense to bet super big. King 10. So pretty standard button open. This player calls and then checks, so it's pretty similar to another hand we played. Ace 4 texture here. Not a good texture for me, so I'm just going to check back. But opponent checks twice, so probably a good spot just to pick up the pot here. Ace 10 offsuit. I decided to 3-bet here. This is not a value 3-bet as such. I just think it's a 3-bet that has a high expectation. So it's probably a little bit weak to consider it a value 3-bet, and it's definitely too strong to consider it as a bluff. But the expectation of 3-betting is very often going to be much higher than flatting. So although it's very difficult to completely categorize this player's value or bluff, 3-betting is going to be very strong here. It's something we're going to touch on in a little bit when we get to the third point to do with 3-betting. So here we get cold called by the big blind. We're probably behind his range. Not a great flop for us. We don't need to c-bet here. We can happily give up. He checks twice though. So similar to the last hand, we don't want to just say, okay, we've got showdown value, let's check. We need to protect our hand here. It's extremely vulnerable, and it may be the best hand versus stuff like ace king, ace queen. So it's very important that we bet for protection. Again, we're protecting a hand. We don't need to bet super big. So we bet here. And because we're betting for protection on the turn, we can quite comfortably check back the river, because we still beat stuff like ace queen with the ace of hearts, so we don't need to turn a hand into a bluff here or anything. So checking back's fine. And he has pocket sixes, so he picked up a flush draw. I still think it's a pretty bad call in the turn, but that's one of the nice things about betting for protection, is you can sometimes extract value from worse as well. So there's lots of advantages to betting the turn rather than checking. Ace 8 of hearts. I just complete here. I think probably ISO raising might be slightly stronger, but nothing too wrong with completing. I think we may have even seen this hand before in the previous video. No one's that interested in the pot, so if it gets checked down, we just lead basically. It's going to be the best option. 10-9 offsuit, we just complete in the small blind. I think it's a good play. As mentioned, I like to complete quite a lot. Not a great flop, so I don't really want to lead this one. It gets checked down. Again, you could actually 3-way, I'd probably lead this because we pick up a gutter. 4-way, I'm going to be a little bit more cautious. However, the fact remains that despite being in a 4-way pot, it's been checked down, and we should probably lead the river here. We're going to get a ton of folds. We look very strong. No one has a flush. No one has a queen, no one has an 8, no one has a 2. So unless people have like rivered pocket 4s or something, then everyone's going to be folding a huge percentage of the time. Pocket 10s, calling's fine. He checks, we check back. We could even c-bet just because our hand's vulnerable here, but checking's just about okay. He checks twice, so again, this is not a bluff as such. This is just protection. We don't want to let him see a free river if he's got something like queen jack, because then he's going to have like 8 outs against us, so we're giving a 16% chance to suck out. So we're just going to bet and pick up the pot. Okay, so hopefully you now have a better idea of what orphan pots are, how to exploit them, how to pick up some pretty easy money. Let's talk about another situation where we can pick up some money without showdown, which is the pre-flop raiser checks out of position. So villain open raises, we call in position, we cold call, and then on the flop, rather than c-bet, he just checks. So the vast majority of players are exploitable in this particular situation. They're either check folding way too much, so you can even add this stat to your HUD and you'll see that some guys are just check folding like 70 or 80% after they check as a pre-flop raiser. Obviously very exploitable, we can bet very, very wide. And the guys that are actually check calling a reasonable amount, they're not necessarily check calling with the correct range, because they're just check calling with a bunch of weak hands that are not strong enough to c-bet. So even if they are defending with an okay looking frequency, their range ends up being very capped, so we can obviously still exploit them. So obviously if they want to play correctly, they need to defend with the right frequency, but they also need to check call with enough strong hands in their range so that they're not capped. So the vast majority of players are not doing this. We can exploit this, and it's going to be good for our non-showdown winnings. So generally speaking, In this situation, when the pre-flop raiser checks out of position, we should bet extremely wide as it bluffs. So don't worry too much about whether your hand has good potential or anything. If you're not sure, then just bet anyway. It's better to bet as a default than it is to check as a default in this particular situation. Obviously, if your hand is completely useless, then in some cases it can be okay to check. And assuming we bet and we get called, then we should be prepared to barrel aggressively on turn and river cards, because there's a decent chance our opponent's range is capped. If he had something decent, he would see that, especially on a drawy texture. So we can take advantage of this. So pocket threes, we make a cold call on the button, which I think is okay, specifically on the button. If we're in MP, we'd obviously fold something like pocket threes. So not a good flop for us. Opponent checks. So his c-betting range is probably going to be things like king x hands, obviously any set, also things, decent bluffs, things like ace queen, queen 10, 9 10, spades. So his checking range a lot of the time is going to be hands that are giving up, just some things like maybe some suited aces. Like if he has ace 5 of hearts, he's probably check folding, or it can be some showdown hands that he's either check calling or check folding depending on his style, things like jack x, pocket 9s, pocket 10s, 8x. He also has some stuff like pocket 5s, your very easy folds. So you're occasionally probably going to get called by stuff like ace jack, but overall he's going to be folding way too much in this situation, and even when he does call, he's probably not going to be able to get to the river very effectively. So we definitely should bet here, and in most cases we're literally just going to pick up the pot here, so it's very easy money. And if you can also figure out how to play well in the turn and river, then that's just a bonus, and you'll be making a lot of additional money on top of that. So pocket fives, similar situation with call versus under the gun. The flop is king 4-2, and there's a reasonable chance we just have the best hand against something like ace queen he doesn't want to see bet. If he does have a made hand, it's going to be something somewhere between pocket fives and pocket queens. Again, it's going to be very hard for him to check call his hand down to the river. Probably doesn't have any clubs in his range because you'd see bet those. So even if we don't get folds directly on the flop, even the strongest hands in his range, like pocket queens for example, he can't call 3 streets with, so we can put him under a huge amount of pressure in this situation. The way you counteract against this, by the way, is you should theoretically be doing stuff like occasionally checking pocket kings or ace king, or even pocket 2s, pocket 4s on the flop, just so I can't get away with doing this against you. But since the majority of players are not doing this, then I can just be very aggressive in this spot, and there's absolutely nothing that our opponent can do about it. So sevens, pretty standard call, MP versus under the gun. Again, he checks. You could have something like kings. You could have queen king. You could have queen jack suited, queen 10 suited. But he probably doesn't have ace king. Probably doesn't have ace queen. Doesn't have aces, queens, eights. Doesn't have any flush draws. So you can really take advantage of him in this particular spot. 7-8 should be okay to call in the spot. Cutoff is under the gun. I know a lot of guys 3-bet this by default. I think calling is a better option. So no equity here really. It's not a good flop for us. However, all the same thing applies. It doesn't really matter actually what our whole cards are in this situation. We could have 2 blank cards and we should be able to exploit our opponent here. That's how profitable this particular situation is. So we don't really care that we've got 7-8. We just pick up the pot. 8-9 of spades. So pretty standard call. Same kind of situation. Okay, our opponent calls here. So what is his range? Well, I think he probably doesn't have ace queen, ace king ever. I don't think he has any set. So we're looking at things like king jack suited, king 10 suited, queen jack, queen 10 suited. Maybe occasionally some things like 10-9 of clubs or something. But I think we're looking at king x or queen x a lot, and then maybe occasionally, as the absolute top of his range, assuming he doesn't protect his range, something like ace 5 of diamonds, maybe even ace 10, maybe ace 10 absolute maximum. But unless he's protecting his range, he doesn't have any set, he doesn't have 10 jack. So if the strongest hand in his range we can actually get him to fold by the river, like ace 10, then we should play pretty aggressively in this spot. So I don't really have any equity, but I choose to barrel this turn card anyway, just because of how I think his range looks. And he ends up folding, but there's really nothing he can do. Unless he starts checking ace king and ace queen on the flop, then we're just going to be printing money from him all day in this particular spot. So keep in mind that, from a game theory point of view, this is probably too wide. From an exploitative point of view, this is a very strong play, despite the fact that we don't have any piece of the board whatsoever. So there's situations in poker like this that we want to learn to recognize where our whole cards just don't matter. The only thing that really matters is our opponent's range and the fact that it's so weak that he can't really get to the river with any of his range unless he significantly improves on some of the turn and river cards. So pocket fives, we cold call here, which I think is okay. Opponent checks. So here we're not really bluffing here. This is actually protection, but we still want to bet for protection as well. It'd be a big mistake just to check here and say, okay, our fives have showdown value, because our fives are so vulnerable here. If our opponent has 2 overcards, he's going to have reasonable equity against us, decent chance to suck out. And it's not just him sucking out. If the turn is the 10 of diamonds and the river's the king of diamonds, now he might have ace queen of clubs and completely have missed that board run out. But it doesn't matter, we can't call anyway because we know that it hits a decent amount of his range, so we protect ourselves from getting bluffed by betting here as well. So very important that we bet here and don't check for our showdown value. 5-2, I call a min raise in this spot because I don't really fold to min raises here ever. We flop an open ender, so again we should bet. Opponent calls, and we should probably bet again because we have a strong draw and it's a great card to barrel, and our opponent's range is capped, so we can easily get him to fold pocket eights here, usually at least. He calls, and the river, he could have a 10. A lot of guys might bet the flop with a 10, so I decided 3 barrel. I think this might be one spot where I actually get called. I can't remember. Yeah, so the bluff doesn't work here. Let's see what he has. So he has ace jack. So despite the fact that I get owned because he calls me down with ace jack high, the fact that he shows up with this specific hand makes me very happy about my play, because again, he's holding a hand that he can't call 3 streets with. He does call 3 streets with his hand, and he doesn't know me presumably, so he's very likely making a huge mistake here. But this is the only way he can win the pot, is by playing absolutely terribly with ace jack. The fact that he shows up with ace jack it feels good to me, because I know that that's part of the range that I assigned him. That's part of his capped range that he just can't call the river with. He does in this case, but we've correctly identified his range is capped, and the vast majority of players are folding ace jack here on the river. So I don't feel bad about him calling. I'm still very happy with my play here, and I think it's a very strong line, and it's going to make a lot of money in the long run. Okay, so the third and final way we're going to look at today of improving our non-showdown winnings, winning without showdown, is to expand our 3-betting range in position. So a common mistake players make is they 3-bet really tight, especially at the lower limits. And actually it is recommended for beginners to 3-bet tight, because you need to learn the game before you start putting yourself into complicated spots. But if you're a more advanced player, then it's going to be a mistake for you to 3-bet really tight, because your win rate could potentially be so much higher if you're putting in a lot of aggression pre-flop in position. It's very hard for opponents to play back against such a style. So the reason why, and we mentioned this at the outset of the video, is especially the lower limits, players say there's no fold equity, so why would you 3-bet bluff pre-flop? It's silly, because no one's going to fold anyway. So this is what I want you to do if you're one of the people that thinks this is true. I'd like you to open up your tracking software, Hold'em Manager, Poker Tracker 4, and run a filter for did 3-bet equals true, so all the hands we decided to 3-bet. And then include your showdown and non-showdown winnings, and look at your red line. Now, I've never seen your 3-bet graph. I've never seen it, but I'm pretty sure I know exactly how it looks. You have a positive red line and maybe a positive blue line, maybe not, but in a lot of cases a positive blue line. But your red line is probably skyrocketing. Now all of that red line profit is from opponents folding. None of that is from you making a hand or anything. That's from your opponents folding. So to say that there's no fold equity at the lower limits is completely untrue. It's there. You just need to know where to look for it, how to find it. And one of the easiest ways to look for that fold equity is to analyze what happens when you have a value hand, because then you don't feel worried about betting. If you have top set, you're obviously going to try and 3-barrel if you can. So if you notice in top set, with top set in a certain spot, you're getting fold on a certain board texture on the turn or on the river, then that's a spot you can think about including some more bluffs in your range and trying to exploit the fold equity that you're getting so far. The nice thing about 3-betting in position, we had an ace-10 offsuit hand earlier where I said it's not really a bluff, it's not really for value. So in a way it's kind of very merged. This is very nice because it's actually a very unexploitable way of playing against the majority of opponents, assuming that they're quite passive. So the idea is, let's say we have something like ace 10 offsuit. Okay, it's a little bit too weak to be a value hand, a little bit too strong to be a bluff. So what happens, we 3-bet something like ace 10 offsuit in that spot. Now either opponent, assuming he has leaks, is either going to call too much or he's going to fold too much. If he folds too much, we make automatic money anyway. We print money. If he calls too much, it doesn't matter, because then we start extracting value. We're going to have a high equity hand in position. We're going to make that profitable. So we don't even really mind that much whether our opponent calls too much or folds too much. What we do know is that being heads up in position in a 3-bet pot with the initiative is inherently profitable, especially if we have a high equity hand. So let's look at some situations now where we can think about expanding our 3-betting range. So here's another such situation. We're actually 3-betting ace queen suited here, MP versus under the gun. This is actually a very, very strong line. And again, it's not really a value 3-bet. Probably you realize that we can't generally 3-bet ace queen suited for value in this spot unless we're playing against a very fishy player. And although it's technically a bluff, it's pretty strong to be a bluff. But what we can say for certain is that since we're in position, this is going to be inherently profitable, and it's probably going to be significantly more profitable than just flat calling. So it's a very decent spot to, I mean, I'm thinking of this as a bluff essentially, but it's so much equity with this particular hand that it's so much more than a bluff. Here we see, but I think it's important to protect our hand here. And on the turn, it's a little bit less important to protect specifically on the turn now, because we probably won't get another streak from something like pocket jacks, pocket tens, or anything else for that matter. Plus, we're a little bit protected due to the spade redraws. And in fact, it's not completely necessary to protect the flop actually, because the flop texture is quite dry. We're only really scared of a king. So I do decide to see it in this case, but actually you could definitely legitimately check the flop here with the intention of calling the turn and then deciding on the river. I decided to go for a bet, check, and then if he checks again, he is most likely holding at a stage is something like queen king suited or queens or jacks tens. He doesn't have kings or aces here ever. He would lead the river, so we should have a pretty profitable value bet here on the river, hoping he calls with jacks or something. When he folds, I'm guessing he's either folding jacks or tens, which would be a good fold, or maybe he floats on the flop with ace king or something and then folds a river. That's possible as well. So ace 3, very good spot to 3-bet. Again, it is a bluff, but we have significant equity in this case. And if it turns out our opponent is a huge fish, then he might call us with stuff like king queen, king jack. So it's not a big deal if our bluff doesn't work that frequently, because if our bluff stops working frequently, it means our opponent's calling wider. It means we're going to have more equity against his range post-flop, so the post-flop situation is going to become more profitable. So in other words, the only way our opponent can really defend against this is to defend with exactly the right frequency, and in particular he has to start 4-betting aggressively against us, because if he's just calling us passively, then we're basically going to run him over regardless of whether he calls too much or folds too much. There's nothing he can really do to defend against us by just calling, so the only way to defend is for him to start 4-betting aggressively. Here we do actually get cold called, and on this flop ace 10-10, I think we can probably just check back because our hand's reasonably well protected. There aren't too many scare cards. We fill up on the turn, which is nice, so it's obviously good to just start going for value. We don't need to bet big here because both players have indicated that they have a weak range. He shoves the river here, and obviously we lose to ace jack, so it's a pretty awkward spot, but I think calling is going to be good here. Okay, ace 6 again. So these hands, they're basically good against any position. So button versus cutoff, great. Button versus under the gun, great. Even MP versus under the gun. Suited aces are powerhouse hands. They have so much equity, and in position they're going to play really well. Here the flop is not great. We don't have to see what this flop. I think maybe I had a read on this guy or something. So I decided to c-bet, and then I turn an ace. So by this point we should really just be thinking about betting again for value and checking back the river, especially with the draws out there. We don't want to give a free card on this turn, so just bet here for value is generally good. But it's the pre-flop situation that's most important here. This is essentially for value actually. I would say ace jack, but even if it was a little bit too weak for value, it's still going to be higher EV than flatting in many cases. Here we have 2 overs. backdoor straight, so I decided to c-bet. And here on the turn, this is a great bluff card. We have good equity. We have a double gutter, so any king or any nine gives us a straight. So I think this is a pretty clear bluff shove on the turn. And I think he snap calls, but given what he snap called with, I'm pretty happy with my play. I think he has he has pocket nine, so we had a huge amount of equity on the turn, and he also has a hand that he shouldn't be calling with. I think he makes a bad call on the turn here, so both those things taken into consideration, given that he shows up with pocket nines, I'm very happy with my bluff shove. If he specifically turned over his whole card and showed me pocket nines, then I would shove ace jack for sure. So I'm very happy with my play. I think he makes a not so great call. Ace king. This is presumably just a value 3-bet. But one thing to keep in mind is under the gun versus MP versus under the gun. If under the gun makes it 3x or so, we can't 3-bet ace king for value. So from that point of view, it's not really a value 3-bet, but it's certainly not a bluff as such because we have ace king. So from that point of view, it's really just acknowledging that 3-betting has a higher expectation of flatting in this particular spot, even if we can't clearly define the line as a bluff or a value bet. 3-betting often is going to be stronger than actually flatting. Because the way players would commonly argue that you can't 3-bet ace king against under the gun is they would look at the equity ace king has against their opponent's continuing range, and they would see that ace king actually has less than 50% equity. Therefore, they would assume that consequently the best option is to flat, but that's actually not logical. Just because we can't technically refer to it as a value bet, and we don't actually have over 50% equity against our opponent's continuing range, that does not under any circumstances mean that we can't 3-bet. 3-betting is still very likely going to be the highest EV option. In this particular case, I think our opponent might just be fishy, so given his sizing, so obviously you just want to extract value, and even on the river we could possibly extract an additional bet, so and he calls us down with king queen. So and obviously just because it's not a value bet doesn't mean that you can't get called by worse hands also, so there's always that additional expectation through getting called by worse. King 10, this is a bluff, but it's a high equity bluff, so it's not impossible our opponent calls us queen jack suited or something. We have 2 overs, backdoor straight, it's a pretty good board to bet. The turn is not a good card to continue barreling, we don't have a ton of equity, so in most cases I would check the turn here. I think in this case I decided to 2-barrel again. I think I had a read on the guy. I think he was calling flops too wide and folding turns way too much, so I decided to 2-barrel in this case. And it's always nice to have a king as a backup because he can have something like 10s, jacks, queens, in which case I've got an overcard, which is always nice. So this was a read based play. Normally I would check back the 3 of clubs. Ace queen, similar to before, this is not a value 3-bet. It's actually a bluff, but again it has so much equity that it's hardly correct to refer to it purely as a bluff. So the idea is, and I think we have 4 more hands to review. So the idea is we want to be pretty aggressive 3-betting in position, and especially the high equity hands. Notice we haven't really 3-bet any speculative hands so far. It's mainly high equity hand in position because they have excellent playability. So even if we're not making direct money pre-flop, we're probably going to make some money post-flop doing this. So if you were to open up your tracking software, you should see that you have a button 3-bet of somewhere between 8 to 10% at least. If you see that your button 3-bet is 6%, then there's probably room for improvement. So it can easily be 10% 3-bet on the button, maybe even higher potentially. And then take somewhere like MP. Your MP 3-bet should be about 4 to 5%. So if you see that you're 3-betting 2% from MP, then there's significant room for improvement in your game for increasing your winnings without showdown. So here we 3-bet high equity hand in position. Again, it's first and under the gun open, so it's debatable whether it's a value, but we do know that 3-betting is likely a higher expectation than flatting in this particular spot. Here we bet very small, partly to do with that kicker and partly to do with the fact that the board's reasonably dry. We can bet a bit larger on the turn and use his hand as part of a 3 streets plan. Here I think we just want to shove, obviously, because he's only got 28 left and he can so easily have a king x, so pretty easy value shove there. But again, the important part is the pre-flop play really. So ace jack suited, again another excellent hand. This is not a value 3-bet. It is a bluff, but it's a very powerful bluff and we intend to use equity post-flop. Here's a spot where you can c-bet more frequently than is theoretically correct too, because when you think about the value range we're representing here, it's like aces and kings, so we can c-bet a whole ton of flops usually. So I tend towards c-betting even some hands that don't really connect that well with the flop here, just because we're representing such a strong range. Obviously we should give up at this point onwards, and then there's a pretty decent chance we've sucked out on the river versus queens or kings, so obviously want to value bet here, and I think villain probably makes a good fold in this particular case. Probably folds queens, I would imagine. King Jack, again, it's not a value 3-bet. It's very strong to be bluffing with, but the expectation of 3-betting is probably higher than the expectation of flatting, and in this case we just take the pot down pre-flop, which is going to happen a significant percentage of the time. Queen 7 definitely strong enough, button versus cutoff, and this is quite clearly a bluff, but it does have reasonable equity, so we intend to use that to our advantage post flop. Okay, so this brings us to the end of our session on picking up pots without Showdown. Just to recap, the 3 areas were picking up orphaned pots, so pots that no one is interested in. Please take a stab at these pots. The second situation was playing against the pre-flop raiser out of position when he checks and doesn't c-bet. And the third situation here is 3-betting a little bit more aggressively in position. So hopefully if you put some of these changes into practice, you'll find that your red line improves to an extent. So I hope you found this information useful. Thanks very much for watching. This has been Weasel for PokerVIP.com.